You're listening to the Lakewood Vineyard Podcast. We are part of a family of neighborhood churches called the Mile High Vineyard. For more information about our church or those we are connected to, please go to lakewoodvineyard.org. Stay tuned at the end of our podcast for ways you can respond personally to what you've just heard.
Leading up to tonight, I had a lot of people asking me, what does Ash Wednesday mean? And especially for a lot of us in the Protestant tradition, we've kind of disconnected ourselves from the Christian calendar, from liturgy, from ritual, and not necessarily without good reason, but I do think that there are some things we've lost as a result. And to answer the question of what the meaning behind Ash Wednesday is or what the meaning behind Lent is isn't easy, because it's kind of a conglomeration of symbols and meanings. For example, the 40 days leading up to Easter that make up Lent are a reflection of Jesus' 40 days of fasting in the wilderness. But that itself is a reflection of Israel's 40 years in the wilderness. And the fact that Lent sets those 40 days before Easter adds a different layer that wasn't there with Jesus' fasting. And so there's not necessarily one set, plain symbolic meaning, but there's a tone, a mood, a sense of sobriety, somberness, humility, with which we approach Easter and with which we approach the cross and Lent and Ash Wednesday. And so this is all an opportunity for us to do that. For Ash Wednesday, which is where I'd like to kind of focus tonight, it's kind of a liminal space where we transition into the season of Lent. And where Advent is that time leading up to Christmas, where we anticipate, as if with ancient Israel, the first coming of Christ, we reenact that in the present day as we anticipate the second coming. In the same way, there's a sense in which Lent and Ash Wednesday is about sitting in the time leading up to Christ's death and the darkness that creation has experienced before the cross as we maneuver towards the resurrection. Because even now, in the present, after Christ, we are still in the now and the not yet. New creation has dawned, but it has not necessarily fully come. And so as we await the resurrection, the final Easter, we wait. And so Ash Wednesday, what we're going to be doing in a little bit is taking ashes and placing them on your forehead in the shape of a cross. And ashes symbolize dust. This is why they were used in grieving and sackcloth and ashes in the Old Testament. It's a reminder that we are made of dust, and to dust we will return. And in many ways, the whole purpose of Ash Wednesday is to bring us face to face with our own mortality and with our contingency, the degree to which we are dependent on God for life itself, and that apart from Him, there is no life. And for some of you, that may feel dark, this idea of engaging with the reality of our own mortality, or it may even seem wrong. After all, isn't death that great enemy which Christ has defeated on the cross, which He has conquered? Why would we consider and engage with death in this way? And I want to suggest that the purpose is not to celebrate death. Death is that great enemy, and just as Jesus wept at the tomb of Lazarus before He resurrected him, I think we too ought to have a deep, deep, deep disgust for death and what it has done to God's good world. But there is something about recognizing just how much life is not guaranteed to us and is not ours to control or to wield. And I find that Ash Wednesday can be an incredible, profound opportunity for us to not only look death in the face, but to consider our entire relationship with time and with creation and with God's order of all things, to ask ourselves, who is Lord, us or Him? And to you, a illustrate that, I want to use an analogy from Tolkien. And if you know me, the fact that I've preached a couple times and have not used much Tolkien is a travesty. But I love Lord of the Rings, and most of you know J.R.R. Tolkien from Lord of the Rings, from The Hobbit. But he also wrote a lot of mythologies and histories of Middle-earth, some of which can be found in this Silmarillion. And one of the cool things he wrote was an origin for the sun. This idea that there were two trees that used to light up all of Middle-earth with divine light, and Morgoth, the kind of Satan figure, he destroyed those trees. And so the Valar, the angels, they kind of gathered up the last vestiges of light. They placed them into a vessel, and one of them volunteered to commandeer it through the sky to keep that light and to keep Middle-earth from falling into utter darkness. And, for a lot of us, that's a silly story, a silly explanation for the sun. And it probably reminds many of us of all kinds of mythologies and stories that humans used to tell to try and explain the sun and the moon and the stars that to us seem primitive. But I want to ask you, when you consider the fact that we in the modern day are aware that the sun is a giant gas ball and planets are space rocks and it's all just floating there suspended in space, I'm not here to say that that isn't cool, but it is in some ways a bit too plain, a bit too straightforward, a bit too disenchanted in my view. We don't assign meaning to the sun anymore like the ancients used to. And when we read the Bible, what's interesting is that the biblical authors were deeply interested in thinking about creation in a living way. In Job 38, 32 through 33, God says to Job, "Can you lead forth a constellation in its season? Can you guide the bear, a constellation, with her satellites? Do you know the ordinances of the heavens, or fix their rule over the earth?" In Psalm 104, 19 through 23, the psalmist writes, "He made the moon for the seasons, and the sun knows the place of its setting. You appoint darkness, and it becomes night, in which all the beasts of the forest prowl about. The young lions roar after their prey and seek their food from God. When the sun rises, they withdraw and lie down in their dens, and man goes forth to do his work and his labor until evening." Notice that whereas we often think of creation as a system, a machine that is flowing automatically after God set it up, they think of God as intimately involved and commanding and speaking over creation, setting the boundaries, telling the stars where to go, and providing food even for the lions at night. But also think about that notion that when the sun goes down, man has to sleep, because it's the space for the night creatures to go out and to be provided for and sustained. And then when the sun comes up, then man can do their labor. For most of human history, we have not had light bulbs, we have not had night shifts, we have not had, this idea that the rising and setting of the sun is of no matter to us, that we can go to sleep when we wish to and wake up when we wish to. We've been reliant, contingent on the time cycle that God set. And beyond that, there's this sense in which, because of the internet, because of technology, because of just our perspective of a lot of things, we seem to live in a disenchanted age where everything is instantaneous. We are deeply disconnected from the traditions and the stories of our peoples. The world it's small, it's instant, it's accessible, and it's thoroughly dissected, and we feel understood. If we can rob the cosmos of its vastness, its mysticism, its mystery, then we can control it. We can understand it, we can predict it, and we feel a little bit safer. But if God is a wild God, what are we losing? I think a salient example of this is our relationship with time. Not just the sun rising and setting, but time itself. After all, we talk about time like it is a resource to be spent, or to waste time, to use time, to hold it, to have it. And all of our language treats it as an object to be kept or to be lost. But the reality is that time, you can't wield it. It happens to you. You cannot speed it up or slow it down no matter how hard you try. St. Augustine, he explains in Confessions a brilliant, profound little quote about time. And I'm sorry if it's hard to follow, it's pretty abstract. He says, "What then is time? I know well enough what it is, provided that nobody asks me. But if I am asked what it is and I try to explain, I'm baffled. How can the past and the future be when the past no longer is and the future is not yet? And as for the present, if it were always present and never moved on to become the past, it would not be time, it would be eternity. If therefore the present is time only by reason of the fact that it moves on to become the past, how can we even say that the present is, when the reason why it is that it is not to be? In other words, we cannot rightly say that time is except by reason of its impending state of not being. But in spite of this, we persistently imagine that time is something we can not only understand, but that is a resource at our disposal, that we can control it, that is a thing, an object, a thing within space, even though in actuality it bitterly resents conforming to our constructions of it. Abraham Joshua Heschel, who's a 20th century Polish-American rabbi, that's a mouthful, he said it this way. He said, "We suffer from a deeply rooted dread of time, and we stand aghast when compelled to look into its face. To us, time is sarcasm. It's a slick, treacherous monster with a jaw like a furnace, incinerating every moment of our lives. Shrinking, therefore, from facing time, we escape for shelter to things of space, to things, to objects. The intentions that we're unable to carry out, we deposit in space. Possessions become the symbols of our repressions, jubilees of frustrations. But things of space are not fireproof. They will only add fuel to the flames." Think about it. Young people think about the 20s as about the only time of their life that matters. And once they hit 30, it's downhill from there. And if you're already past 30, you've probably reached the point where you dread each birthday, you no longer celebrate it, and you hide your real age when people ask. And often it's playful, but it's cultural. It's deeply ingrained in us that we dread the coming and the going of time, and in particular, the fact that for each of us it's truly limited and not ours to spend. Within that, we compartmentalize the notion of death. It's a distant thing. We distract ourselves from it. We don't deal with it, and we treat it like the rabbi said, as sarcastic. It's only faintly true, and even then, it's only at a great distance from us. But what would it look like to calmly consider your lifespan, to estimate realistically, based on averages and where you're at, how much longer you have, to place a countdown on your phone, and just have that going all the time? Could you do that without becoming paralyzed by anxiety? Why? Why is something like that so terrifying to us when it's a reality we all know is coming and we're all aware of somewhere deep inside? There's a Christian artist, Josh Garrels. He writes about the way in which our relationship to time is almost oppressive, and the fact that Sabbath becomes a kind of rebellion against it. The song's called "The Resistance," and he says this: "My rest is a weapon against the oppression of man's obsession to control things. Look at the long line of make-believe kings, and the Lord of the Flies wants you to kiss his ring." Adding to that, as Christians, we build in a theology that we've inherited that kind of supports this idea that we are inherently immortal. And I'm not going to spend a long time on this, but I think it's important, especially when we consider our mortality. In the Bible, the Hebrew word that we often translate as soul is nephesh. And it most literally means throat. Now, in the Greek philosophical tradition, which Christianity early on inherited, the soul is an inherently immortal thing that is inside each of us, which longs to escape this flesh prison and be in the spiritual, which is more real than the physical. And Christians adopted that and very quickly lost sight of bodily resurrection that was promised to us. And we also created a narrative based on that philosophy that our soul is something that we have, that is in us, and that will go on just because that's what it does. But in the Hebrew Bible, nephesh is quite different. In Genesis 1:20, we read, "Then God said, 'Let the waters teem with swarms of nephesh, and let birds fly above the earth in the open expanse of the heavens.'" These are fish. These are living creatures being described as nephesh, souls. In Genesis 19, Lot, as he's talking to the angels who are telling him to flee Sodom and Gomorrah, he says, "I cannot escape to the mountains, for the disaster will overtake me and I will die. Please let me escape there, that my nephesh may be saved," his physical life. In Numbers 6:6, these are the Nazirite vows and laws. It says, "All the days of his separation to the Lord, a Nazirite shall not go near a dead nephesh." That's right, a nephesh can refer to a dead thing. And then in Psalm 23, a very famous psalm, we read that he restores, typically it's called soul. He restores my nephesh. He guides me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. The idea is that the throat is the passage through which life, breath, food, sustenance, water passes. And therefore it can be used to describe our entire being, living or dead. But notice that it definitely is not spiritual or inherently immortal. This is why in Genesis 2:7, we're told that God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living nephesh. And for some of you, me saying this and saying it so quickly may be jarring and even hurtful. I know that it was jarring for me. But I want to express the beauty of it. Because what this tells us is that you are a dirt creature animated by divine breath, and your entire life essence, your ability to live, is sustained only by God's ongoing work and sustenance of all things. And if he were to take that life breath away from you, you're dust, and to dust you will return. And this is where the promise of resurrection is so powerful. This is also why when God told Adam and Eve, "If you eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will surely die," he didn't summarily execute them once they ate of it. He cut them off from the tree of life. Because we are by nature mortal. We're contingent on his source of life, his tree of life. And without him, we're dust. This is why in Acts 17:28, Paul says, as he's talking to the Greek philosophers, "In him, in God, we live and move and exist, have our being." We're contingent. We're dependent. So what then? Even if we have an unhealthy relationship with death and live as if we're already immortal, doesn't the promise of resurrection make us functionally immortal? Shouldn't we despise death? Josh Garrell's song, "The Resistance," it goes on past the quote I quoted earlier. And he goes on to say this: "Lesson number 1, overcome. Every fear of regret and confusion, it's all illusion, delusion, sent to disconnect the holy fusion, the divine breath and the dirt, of spirit and the flesh. Every mortal breath is meant to bring forth fire, but only when the fear of death gets consumed on the funeral pyre. So let the flames rise higher, let every man be considered a liar if he doubts the goodness and faithfulness of God." I'm not here to encourage you guys to celebrate death. I'm here to encourage you to look it in the face and to recognize that it's coming. You've not been promised immortality. What you have been promised is rescue. Death is a real thing that we must engage with so that we become deeply and utterly aware of the ways in which our sin cut us off from him, from life, place us in the realm of death, and also in looking to the fact that both we have nothing on our own apart from God, and we don't even have rescue from it apart from God. Both our current sustenance and our future deliverance are both entirely dependent on Christ and what he's already done for you. And so my encouragement tonight, as we enter into the Lenten season, we consider this period of fasting, this period of intentionality of looking towards the cross and towards Easter, this section of the year that is dedicated to humility and a surrendering of our own sovereignty and lordship over time, over our schedules, over our own ability to produce just about anything over to God. What would it look like for the thing you give up, the thing that you fast, to be something that you would typically think of as being a source of life. For example, food. Food is a fantastic option for fasting because to give it up is to remind yourself that actually bread and water are not the thing that sustain you, but rather the bread and the water of life, which is Christ. That he is the ultimate sustenance which you must look to. And so by laying down food and water, we are invited to consider what actually gives us life. But some other options that would be radical, equally radical, would be, what does it look like to lay down your alarm clock and your calendar and to let yourself, the rising in the morning and the setting of the sun at night, dictate your schedule and the way you sleep and the way you wake up? What would it look like to become radically accustomed with the Christian calendar and to say, okay, God, your perspective of time, your perspective of creation is going to guide my relationship to it? What are some things you could do that would say, okay, apart from Christ, I'm nothing, I'm dust. And that by giving those things up, you could become that much more aware of him. And when Easter comes and you pick it back up, could make Easter that much sweeter, that much more joyous, that much more beautiful. So we're going to enter into a time of worship, of prayer, and of placing the ashes on your head. And I encourage you to pray fervently and powerfully to ask God to dwell with you, to love you, and to speak to you, to tell you what he would like you to fast, to give up. That you'd be willing to do something radical for the sake of beholding his face and developing a more acute awareness of where you're at and where he's at and who he is. And then, once you have come to a decision with Christ on what you plan to fast, come up and receive the ashes in the shape of a cross, not only to remind you that you are dust, but also to remind you that the resurrection is coming because of the cross.
Thanks for listening to the Lakewood Vineyard podcast. We encourage you to respond to what you've just heard by sharing a prayer request with us on our Connect card. You can find these on our app or our website at lakewoodvineyard.org/connect. You can also respond by being generous as God has been generous to you. If you'd like to give a financial gift, you can do so at lakewoodvineyard.org/give. We hope to hear from you soon. Thanks for listening.